Hello and welcome to Note Doctors. My name is Paul.
My name is Jenn.
My name is Ben.
And we are your hosts. We are all university music theory instructors who are passionate about music theory and music theory instruction. In this podcast, we will be talking about all things theory with some of the best music theory teachers in the country. If you want to know more about music theory and the most effective and innovative ways to teach it, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome back to Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. So we're actually going to be finishing up our little tour of Texas, actually, with our last three guests here. So we've gone from UT Arlington to UT San Antonio. And now we are talking with Kyle Gullings, who is at UT Tyler. So we've just been making a circuit of all the UT system universities here. But we have a great conversation with Kyle about his work with openmusictheory.com and the things that he has going on with that. Before we get into the conversation, let's hear a little bit more about Dr. Gullings.
Dr. Kyle Gullings is Associate Professor of Music Theory and Composition at the University of Texas at Tyler, where he also served as Director of the School of Performing Arts from late 2019 through May 2023. His opera and chamber vocal compositions have earned him national finalist recognitions in the National Opera Association's Chamber Opera Composition Competition and twice in the SCI ASCAP Student Composition Competition. That's an alliteration. He is a co-author of the free online open educational resource music theory textbook, Open Music Theory Version 2, and his peer-reviewed articles appear in Engaging Students, Essays in Music Pedagogy, and the NACWAPI Journal.
I sometimes would get into the trap of just only asking those really base level questions of, can you identify this chord? Can you write this scale? And just realizing that any topic, even if it's a fundamentals topic, can somehow be applied to, if you do some creative thinking about it, to some sort of higher order thought. And so putting some time into like moving up the Bloom's taxonomy of like, it's not just rote memorization, it's not just being able to see something and put a name to it, but it's actually like either analyzing something or contextualizing it, or I don't know, for us composers on the recording, write a new piece of music involving those topics.
Kyle, we're so happy to have you on the podcast to talk with you about your work with open music theory and just all the assignments that you have made. And because I was doing some research and I'm like, holy smokes, you've got a lot out there. And so we're excited to talk with you and see how you find time to sleep still. But before we get into all of that, we always like to ask our guests a little bit about how they got into music theory. And I'm assuming it wasn't just the thought that you might get onto a music theory and pedagogy podcast one day, if podcasts even exist, or if you knew that podcasts existed back then. But what really kind of brought you into the music theory world?
Yeah, I mean, getting on this podcast was, of course, the ultimate goal that I think we all share. No, I honestly wasn't aware of it until you and I met, Paul, this year, and I'm a little embarrassed to say that. I'm so happy now that I've got 50-something episodes to go back and listen to. I'm honestly, in all seriousness, very, very excited to get back into diving into that. I've listened to a couple episodes, and that'll maybe come up later. But how did I get into music theory? I'm a bit of an outsider, I still feel like, and probably always will in the music theory community, because none of my degrees are in music theory. My undergrad was in music theory and composition, but really it was mostly composition, and that was my senior project was a composition recital, and then both of my graduate degrees are in composition. But how I fell into it kind of on accident was I've just kind of always liked doing theory, I guess. And so I'm a composer by training, but I fell in love with music theory pedagogy along the way. I actually still today in my current chair role actually do and enjoy music theory teaching more than than composition, and that's always been more of my job, as you might imagine. And so I love it. Don't tell all my composition colleagues that, but I if I had to give half of my job away, it would be the composition side. And when I became chair of our department in 2019, that's what I did. I hired somebody else to do the composition so that I could keep teaching freshman and sophomore theory in particular. I just love it. If I could just only teach that for my teaching career, that would be fine for me. So I got started in undergrad. I went to Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, a liberal arts college. And so they're very big on, exploring different options. I was a music composition major. I had minors in theater and English writing. For some reason, 19-year-old me thought I was a poet or a playwright. That minor taught me that I'm not a playwright or a poet. But one of the things that allowed me to do was design a special topics course for myself during my junior year that was supposed to explore potential career paths. And, I not knowing was doing so, I had essentially created a graduate TA-ship, or I guess an undergraduate TA-ship, maybe you'd call it. As a junior, I sat in on all of the Music Theory 1 lessons and taught a couple, I think, 2 or 3 20-minute sessions on specific topics that I had prepared ahead of time. But mostly I, attended Theory 1 again and graded worksheets. And so that's really kind of where I fell in love with teaching music theory. I didn't really see it as a thing to do. At the time, my current career path was go write musical theater for Broadway, right? Which my dad, who's a dentist who does not have any musical experience, was like, that is not a job. You know that, right? He's almost right. But thankfully, I fell into that. From there, I think like a lot of us who ended up teaching this professionally, I was a TA in grad school, even though I was on the composition side. I spent so my master's and my doctorate are both from Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and both in composition. So I spent, I guess, 4 or 5 years there as a TA teaching theory courses. And by the time I left, it was kind of a traditional TA-ship where, it was kind of under the supervision of a particular teacher. And, we met very regularly about the resources and the learning expectations. The first couple of years, it was not in a terrible way, but it felt a little bit like the Wild West, where I my second year there, I was when I started teaching, and it really felt like, here's the Casca Pane, start in chapter 8 and get to chapter 15, see you in April. That was kind of my introduction. And so I really was, like instructor of record. And we had weekly meetings and I could always ask questions, but it was a little bit like, how do I teach this? What specifically do I teach? It was just get through the book. And so I kind of like that experience. I don't know that I would wish it on other people, but it was good to kind of be thrown in the deep end when I didn't really know. I mean, I knew, but I didn't know at all, like how to teach, enharmonic modulations or things like that. And by the time we got to that, it was just, I'm just reading a chapter ahead of my students. Anyway, so let's see. I've been taking a long time. How did I get to music theory? So on accident, sideways, while trying to become a composer. And then, like I mentioned, the majority of my teaching load here at UT Tyler, University of Texas at Tyler, which is where I've spent all of my professional career since getting hired in 2011, was, as you might expect, teaching music theory. I would teach 3 or sometimes 4 music theory focused classes. And then the composition stuff was kind of whatever's left over, the 3 or 6 composition students we had. And so because of that, I made a decision really early on in my professional career because of where I got planted, right, because of where I ended up with the full-time position, to really invest a lot of my time and my research time into the theory side, even though I didn't have that music theory PhD kind of credential and background and official training. Anyway, I could probably go on, but that's kind of how I got into theory. Was on accident, but a happy accident.
I 100% relate because I'm right there with you. With none of my degrees are in theory; they're in composition. My undergrad is in theory composition, but again, it was a little liberal arts school, so it was really primarily composition. So that's part of the reason I wanted to do this podcast, is so I could meet people, because I'm such an outsider too.
Nice. Where Working your way into the community.
That's right. But I think that brings a different perspective, and we might get into this later in the conversation. But I think there's actually, and what I've learned in talking to folks is that a lot of people are not on that kind of traditional track. There are a lot of kind of, closet composers, as it were, that got into it or were into performance or education or other things. But along the way, this is pretty much universal. They found music theory and they're like, yeah, that's the thing. That's what I want to kind of latch on to. And so I think it's really interesting. One of the, I think I saw you present at a CMS. I think Jenn and I were at the same one. It was a CMS thing in Oklahoma, maybe, or something like that. But you were presenting on open education resources and talking about kind of the assignments that you've created, which are now available on JMTP's website and things like that. And so can you talk a little bit about the task that you put yourself into in creating basically a curriculum's worth of assessments and assignments together? What made you do that? And what did you learn?
That's not a small feat.
No,
that's a massive job.
Yeah. I mean, I did it because I didn't have someone older and wiser to tell me not to, I guess. But in seriousness, I started here in 2011. I first became aware of version 1 of openmusictheory.com, I don't know, in late 2012 or maybe 2013. I'm not really sure when it came online, but that's when it crossed my radar for the first time. And I had been using the Casca Payne tonal harmony from, as a freshman in undergrad. And that's also what I taught all through grad school. So it was like the only book I had any experience with. I did take a music theory pedagogy class, much to my graduate school's credit. They didn't send me out into the world not knowing anything about teaching. So we did get to review quite a few books there and talk about approaches. So good job, Catholic University. But really, Casca Payne was the only thing I knew from a functional standpoint. And I may be overstepping on some later questions, but I teach at a regional public university. It's got about 10,000 students. And so we are in a fairly rural area. And a lot of our students are transfer students who go to community college. Like about half of our music majors start out at community college and come here as juniors. In East Texas, that's a really big thing. There's a lot of really strong community colleges. And a lot of our students, I don't know how a percentage, but a lot of our students work either part-time or some of them full-time while going to school. And that tells me that they, maybe more so than some other student populations, are sensitive to cost, right? I think we all know that going to school has gotten more expensive over the last forever, but especially the last 15 years or so. But what a lot of people don't know is that the cost of resources, the cost of textbooks has outpaced the increase of college tuition and fees. We know that tuition and fees is a sort of an exclamation point increase, right? It's going up in a sizable way. But books and other resources have more than kept pace with that increase. And when I learned that, I kind of made it somewhat my mission, right, to help these students in a really tangible way, not have to buy an expensive textbook. So I found open music theory and thought, well, I guess I should probably try to adopt this. And at the time, it covered quite a few topics. There were a few things probably that it was missing that it needed to have fleshed out. A few things I've since had explained to me were covered in somewhat an idiosyncratic way that real music theory pedagogues, the people with PhDs, can explain to me. But the main issue I had as a practical composer / theorist was it didn't have any workbooks attached to it, right? It didn't have any assignments, it didn't have any exams, it didn't tell me what to cover at what time. And so I thought, if I'm really going to do this, it's got to be like a major part of my output, right? It's not like I can have them buy the textbook and then a little bit incorporate this free thing. It doesn't really do the job. So essentially what I did was, I think starting 2013, the beginning of my third year on the tenure track, I pretty much hit pause on all of my traditional composing and other RSCA, and said, I'm just going to do this. And I spent the next 2 years writing pretty much 1 or 2 worksheets a week for, well, I guess one worksheet a week for the next like 2 years straight. So I started where the sophomore class was still on the proprietary text, but the freshman class was on open music theory. But it didn't have any workbooks, so I was like constantly writing, worksheets. And I got to where I was turning out, one every week or two. And then the next year I was doing that for the upper division, or sorry, the second level. And so that was pretty much all I did for 2 years. And so you see my compositions kind of like disappear for a little bit, and then they come back after that. Because of that, that's really what I did. So that's why I did it. I made that so that I could make that switch to open music theory and make it possible for myself. And then I thought, well, I spent so much time doing that, I should probably try to get it out into the world. I don't know a whole lot of famous music theory teachers. I didn't know anyone who had been on this podcast yet. I don't think it existed yet.
It didn't exist yet. No. We thought.
Yeah. So we're all building resources to help the community, right? But I didn't have a big network of professional theorists to get it out in the world, and so I ended up submitting it to JMTP, their resources page, and they thankfully accepted that, which is been nice. I still pretty frequently, either through them or through my own website, get every few weeks or a couple of months sometimes get questions about some of those sheets or requests to access some things on my Google Drive. Anyway, I don't know where I'm going with that other than to say that's how I got started on it.
Oh, I'll take a follow-up if you're up for it. Some of us like to design our own assignments. I know I'm a big fan of that. Some people like to more import, from a workbook, like you've mentioned. But kind of having done both, it sounds like you've kind of done a little bit of both. What kind of trends emerge? What are the features of the best assignments in music theory? And then what are kind of the things that, this one was in this assignment and I think it could have done without it. Can you kind of hit at some of those points for us? Because I think a lot of us are at this crossroads where I know I am. I like some of the things that I've designed myself, but I don't have the time to do everything myself. Like you said, you had to set everything else aside. So, if we were to create one new assignment or rework one assignment every semester, what are the things that we have to keep in mind? What are the real things we really need to know?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most of my answer to that, I think, will be just me saying things back to you that my open music theory version 2 colleagues have taught me over the past several years, because they're really kind of the experts in the pedagogy side of as well as just the research of the field. But so the first couple of things, accessibility. If this is something that you want to share, not just with your students but with other students elsewhere. Doing just a tiny bit of research about Creative Commons licensing. If you're okay with other people taking your work and not paying you for it, for example, there's easy ways to just slap a CC BY license on that and let people know up front, hey, you can take this for free as long as you say where you got it, for example. And so, yeah, Creative Commons and accessibility, also accessibility from a functional user standpoint, which is something that I admittedly don't know as much about as I need to. But, that's one big part of our Open Music Theory version 2 revision. Was we decided early on we were going to put all of our worksheets into MuseScore format, which was bizarre to me as a composer at first because I use Finale, right? I'm an expert engraver. And I had never used MuseScore before, and it was a confusing world to me. But they really, my project co-authors really sold me on that when they basically explained not everyone has Finale, not everyone has the money to use Finale, but everyone can get to MuseScore, and then if they find an error in your worksheet, or if they have something they want to edit about it or swap in a new example, they can do that without asking you if you give them the right license to do so. And then lastly, I guess somewhat related to that, thinking about diversity and repertoire, which again is admittedly not something I had given any thought to really before I, approached this topic in terms of like, what music are we teaching? Who is it written by, and why is that important? I think that's something that's becoming more and more important, not just to the field and the experts in the field, but also to the students as well. And actually talking openly about that and saying like, hey, we're listening to this piece by this composer. A lot of my students don't know who Haydn is anyway, so you might as well say, hey, but here's another person you don't know, right? But I think it's really important that students have a kind of a wide variety of music to look at. One last thing is I guess something that, regardless of what format you're using or anything like that, really focusing, if you're going to do one or two assignments really well. This is something that I got in the habit of just cranking these out, once every week or two. And not all of them are these really like deep dives into music theory. A bunch of them are like, here's 35 math problems, do them. and of course, to some degree, that has its utility and its need. But I sometimes would get into the trap of just only asking those really base level questions of, can you identify this chord? Can you write this scale? And just realizing that that any topic, even if it's a fundamentals topic, can somehow be applied to, if you do some creative thinking about it, to some sort of higher order thought. And so putting some time into like moving up the Bloom's taxonomy of like, it's not just rote memorization, it's not just being able to see something and put a name to it, but it's actually like either analyzing something or contextualizing it, or I don't know, for us composers on the recording, write a new piece of music involving those topics. So that's something that you can't make every assignment like that, because you do need to like learn the basics. But yeah, anyhow.
No, I totally agree. I've gotten some of the best responses with prompting students, why did you choose to have a particular timbre for this character or in this scene? Or I'm really into film music, done these superheroes and villain things in the last couple of years, but I've showed students a scene and they kind of get a prompt that's non-musical, and it's, they don't even think about non-musical prompts. They're just thinking about spelling chords, and like music theory is like chord spelling, and I'm like, y'all, theory is not about chord spelling. That's just a means to which you can build understanding, and that very basic thought, can come across in our assignments when we say, okay, write the 5 of 2 and then write the 5 of 5 and write the 5 of 6, and it's great to get a mix, like you say. I believe in doing some things for memorization and spelling and all those identification-based activities, but man, it really helps them connect to the art, the concept, when you give those deeper level questions. I love that.
Yeah, like one of the sheets, and I'm not sure if it's in my collection on JMTP, I think it is, but one of the assignments that I really like doing is in Music Theory 4. I've got this Schoenberg versus Stravinsky project that I tell them up front, this is the longest and hardest assignment I will ever give you in the lower division sequence. It's supposed to take you 2 or 3 weeks because, my students don't know who Schoenberg is and they don't know who Stravinsky is. So how are they supposed to get to the end point of this? But I have them, look at Schoenberg's wind quintet and Stravinsky's octet for wind instruments as kind of marking turning points in each of their styles, and the early 12-tone approach and neoclassicism, and to take on kind of the role of a music critic in a newspaper. So they have to like the whole first section is just go read Wikipedia for a little bit, and then go read the specific spots on New Grove about where they were in the 1920s and stylistically what that meant. And then, they look somewhat at sonata form or derivations, I guess, of the sonata form or deviations of it in the Stravinsky, and do some 12-tone row finding in the Schoenberg. And then at the end, they read an essay that it's the only time I think in the whole sequence I asked them to do this, where they try to outline the aesthetic aims of both of those composers and then say which one is better, like which one did a better job of it and which aesthetic is better now that it's 1924. What should we be doing next year as composers? And I'd say more than half of them get the idea of the prompt, and when they do, it's a pretty interesting thing to make them, even if they didn't start out knowing anything about these style periods or composers, it makes them really kind of engage with it in a different way than just pointing out the rows,
Right. So open music theory, there are 7 authors I think listed on open music theory, so very collaborative. how does that work, and how has that played into the resources that you've created there?
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's been a fantastic project, and one that I feel really, really happy and honored to have been part of. To have been part of. That makes it sound like it's over. I'm not sure if it will ever be fully over, but the bulk of the writing is over. It's a usable
It'll never be closed
product.
music theory. It's always open. Always open.
That's exactly what I meant. Yes. More like I just know there's always more we can do to fix it or to add to it, which is a good thing, but also a scary thing because it will never go away. But that's good. That's good. And so, you know, I'll talk first, if you don't mind, about kind of how I got attached to the project, and then talk about kind of the collaborative part of it. Like I mentioned, I had my resources published on Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy resources page, and then maybe a year or two later, I saw that the SMT conference was being held in San Antonio, and I thought, wow, San Antonio, that's only 6 hours from me, which seems like a long ways,
Texas.
but in Texas, that's close.
Short
yeah.
drive in Texas.
Just a little jaunt over to San Antonio. And so I had never attended an SMT before, but I didn't have anything to present. I just went to see it, and was kind of blown away, of course, by some of the presentations. But that's where I met Dr. Megan Lavengood, who is the project lead for the revision of Open Music Theory version 2. I know you all know her. She was one of your guests
Friend
on
of the
the
show.
pod. There you go, friend of the show. And it's kind of weird because I've heard her voice in my earbuds a lot over the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, because she's been the one kind of corralling us about, hey, we need to Zoom, we need to have a meeting about this, we need to talk about the next stage in the chapter, you know, in the project. But I've never really engaged with her research. Again, I'm a composer. I don't spend a whole lot of time reading articles, and it was really interesting that I've got to hear her episode on what she does professionally, and timbre and video game music, and so cool. But so she kind of got us all together. I met her there. I think I also met Bryn Hughes there, University of Lethbridge, and maybe one of the others, and they kind of assembled the team, and I got an email a month or two later saying, hey, we've got this grant proposal due in a month or so through the Virginia Consortium of Libraries that we want to write this textbook, and so that's kind of how I got attached to it. I think they were trying to use those resources that you mentioned and have me in charge of the workbook side. Collaboration has been a big part of this, and this is something that I talk a lot about at conference presentations, paper presentations, whenever I get a chance to stand up in front of people, not only to say how important OER in general is, and that universities need to do a better job of supporting and resourcing the development of teaching resources. I think that's very important, sometimes overlooked. But this is something that I say a lot in these types of presentations, is this book or online resource is way more than it could have been if it was just one or two of us, doing it by ourselves. We all kind of have our own specialties. Megan is obviously a pop music, among many other things, a pop music specialist, and so she took the lead on some of those. So it's brought kind of a diversity of voices and frankly, just more structure, I guess. If you've got 6 other collaborators and they all say, where have you been for the last 3 months? You go, oh, yeah, I guess I probably should work on that chapter. So it's been nice to kind of mutually support each other in meeting some of those deadlines.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I'll note that, it is interesting going to a theory conference, as a composer, because composition conferences or festivals are very different in that you only attend if you have a piece being played, generally. Like, I think pretty much 9 out of 10, everyone is there because of a piece. And at a theory conference, that is not the case at all. You might have only a handful that are presenting, and everyone else is there just to learn and to meet each other and things like that. So it was like a really weird thing for me. I'm like, you're spending all this money, or you're traveling, and you're not even doing anything. You're just showing up. It was just very different than like a composer mindset or a composition conference festival type of situation. But I think that speaks to like the collaborative nature of the field. And I think that's kind of what's exciting. And it's not that being a composer isn't exciting, but composing is a very individual thing a lot of the times. Like you're just by yourself, working, and there is collaboration elements and opportunities, but it is a very kind of individual thing. Whereas theory is this more of a community. Have you found that similar to be the case?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and that's a little bit why I like theory pedagogy more than I like composing, is because I can throw ideas at people and have them tell me what's working and what's not. That for whatever reason is just not the way composition gets done most of the time. And my background as a composer even speaks to that. I'm mostly a composer of operas, musical theater, and either solo voice or chamber works. And so I hate the idea of sitting down and writing a new piece of music and I don't know what it's about or who it's for. Like that just doesn't even terrify me. It just bores me, right? Write a piece of music because you love writing music. If it's not about something or for somebody, I don't usually have any real interest, because of my background as a composer was writing terrible musicals in high school, right? With all my best friends, and putting it on in the community theater. And I still feel kind of like, in a way, I'm kind of chasing that whenever I write a piece of music, is trying to get back to that collaborative sort of focus. And so that's something that I really like about, this group that we have at Open Music Theory, but also the field in general, is that it seems kind of supportive and like you're kind of all doing the same thing together and trying to help each other, at least from what I've seen. So yeah, I definitely appreciate that.
Yeah. I mean, I think you could be the Lin-Manuel Miranda of East Texas, maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
I would be honored if anyone were to call me that, or maybe like send me a business card that says that. That would be great. Yes. Jeez.
Add that to your bio.
Yeah, right. For sure.
I'm curious. So your colleagues, your administrators, that kind of thing, did they have any response to the idea of using an open resource textbook or open resource workbook? Did you get any pushback, or did you get lots of like, oh, this is a great idea? I mean, I'm at the kind of school where we have to run everything by each other. So when I changed my textbook, I had to make sure the entire faculty knew and were aware and had the reasons why and all of that. Not every school is like that, but other faculty often have a sort of stake in the game when it comes to theory because all their students take it. So I just wondered if you had any response from your colleagues or your admin, anything like that, about using an open resource.
Yeah, not so much. I'm at a small school. When I joined here, there were 7 full-time faculty in the department. Now we're up to, I think, 10, including the chair. But it's still pretty small. And I'm almost the only person who has taught Theory 1 through 4 since I got here in 2011, including since I've been chair. And we've got a pretty small program, so we don't have like trailing sections. We don't have a graduate program, so there's no TAs. So it's kind of my own fiefdom in a sense, that whatever textbook I say is what goes. So I didn't really realize at the time that I was making these changes what kind of a blessing that was, to have that freedom to be able to say, hey, this is going to be a change. It's going to be positive for the students. I'll make it happen. The only real formal thing I did was, I think I mentioned it to my chair, and when I reported my books to the bookstore, I said not available, or not applicable. But other than that, at the time they weren't even tracking or counting OER use on campus, I don't think. It was just a thing that few enough people were even doing or aware of, which is too bad. I probably could have gotten some, internal or system grants to redesign my course if I had just waited 2 or 3 more years. But that's okay. I'm happy to have done it. But yeah, so I didn't get a lot of pushback from colleagues because I'm kind of the theory guy here, and didn't get a lot of pushback from my administration because they just kind of said, okay, what textbook do you want to use? And that's probably a challenge at bigger schools where there's multiple theory teachers, or like you said, multiple different areas or divisions within the school that have a vested interest in what's being taught and how it's being taught in the theory curriculum. I imagine that could be one of the challenges of implementing something like this, especially if you've got multiple teachers with different sections. That can always be difficult.
There's actually only 7 full-time folks at my university as well. But we have
Okay.
teams of adjuncts, but it's just kind of our policy that we're very collaborative like that, that we,
Yeah.
if we're making major shifts in one of the areas, that everyone gets to weigh in and say,
Sure.
I think that's great, or here's a concern I have in how it affects my students or whatever. And I'm grateful to have incredibly supportive colleagues, but I also realize that it might not work that way everywhere, that there might be places where instead of them being like, oh, you're changing the book to make it more diverse and applicable, that sounds great. There are places where that wouldn't be the response. So I was just curious,
Sure.
if you'd
Yeah.
had any
Yeah. No, that's a
reactions.
great point. Yeah. No, I didn't really get any pushback. The only downside was, as I kind of jokingly alluded to earlier, I basically put my research on hold for years 3 and 4 of my tenure track and
Oof.
didn't publish anything. I got a couple of compositions I had already written, out on the conference circuit a bit, but it kind of hit pause for a few years on my research. And looking back, I realize now there's nowhere in our operating procedures or our TMP documents that say if you author, a textbook, a class textbook, or if you author resources or OER, this is the way that will be viewed in your tenure application or your promotion application. If I had put more investigation into that, maybe I would have made a different decision, but I would like to think not. But that's something that I think that administrators and faculty senate and departments can really work on a lot, is ask themselves if they care about how much their schooling costs where they teach. And if they do, if that's important to their students, then, is that in some way codified in their TMP document or in their overall sort of university? It's one thing to say we give grant programs for people who want to adopt OER. It's another thing altogether to say it will be recognized and viewed in line with the scholarship of teaching, right? Some institutions think that that's important, and some individual reviewers or administrators think that's important, but it's not universal.
Right.
And even on some campuses where some faculty or a certain department thinks it's important, it doesn't necessarily mean upper administration will, and vice versa. So
Right.
I think we all have a long ways to go in terms of recognizing that making teaching better and easier to get to is one of the core things we do as professors, and find a way to actually incentivize that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm curious, how did you slot that in to your TNP? Because you're associate professor, so you made tenure. You did it. But I'm just curious about how you were able to position that, because regardless if it's tenure or some type of promotional thing, these types of public-facing or teaching materials or scholarship in teaching is sometimes hard to put into, is it research? Is it teaching? Is it service? I mean, this podcast is a good example of, well, what is this? Is it service? Is it research? I don't know, So how were you able to kind of work this research in teaching into your kind of portfolio to benefit yourself in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about it both in the teaching and the research side of my letters. And obviously it had a major impact on my teaching, and it was, I think, the most influential decision I made in pre-tenure to, in my view, improve how I was teaching and what I was teaching and make it more affordable for students. So I tried to make that case on the teaching side. As sometimes happens, the research side usually weighs a little more heavily, I think, at a lot of institutions, even institutions like UT Tyler, which, at the time had not yet moved up to the R2 research university that we became a year ago. So we're very much a teaching, institution still, and we teach a 4.4 load on average, so I made that case on the teaching side, but also on the research side. And I won't go into any details other than to say it was not particularly heavily weighted on my tenure application. And maybe that's because I didn't do a great job of describing these two sort of very unrelated aspects of my professional career, right? I am a composer and I write music and I get people to play it. And I do this music theory pedagogy stuff. And I do this music theory pedagogy stuff because I don't have any degrees in it, and I don't do a lot of scholarly publishing. I've published a couple of times in terms of like assessment or or the use of OER in music in general. But it hasn't been a major part of my scholarly output. And so it was a little bit this other thing that I also did on the side, kind of. And I'm trying more, I don't know exactly when, but within a year or two of going up for full professor now. That's how old I am, I guess. And
don't worry, I'm already there, so you're in good company.
Good. And this is one of the two major sort of linchpins, I think, of my application, is to say, not just, look, I wrote 100 worksheets, but also, look, they're being used and they got incorporated into this other bigger resource that lots of people have used, anyway, that's probably all the details I should go into on my application. But I needed to do a better job of making that case that it's actual scholarship and that it's actual, worthy of being considered alongside having been selected for a presentation. But I would say anything you're going to pour that amount of time into, you need to also spin into some level of deliverables, whether it's a scholarly article or conference presentations, papers, things like that, because I felt a little bit apprehensive doing that at first, because I just kind of felt like a dude who wrote some theory worksheets, right? And so I didn't know that I had much to share, but I sort of looked back and saw, well, I spent a lot of time learning what a Creative Commons license is, and implementing them in my courses and trying to get people to use them. Maybe there's something useful in that journey for other people to talk about as well. So I feel, in a sense, I've kind of been giving, especially at the CMS regionals here in the South Central region, which I'm pretty active in. I've been giving kind of different versions of that same talk for about 6 or 7 years now. It used to be, what is OER and what is OER in music theory? And now it's more like, are you thinking about writing an online textbook with a group of authors? Here's some things you should do up front to make it better. It's kind of, I don't know. But so a little bit of a tangent answer, but.
No, that's good. I think you're absolutely right that highlighting how many people that resource reaches is an important factor in the response from others when you're doing promotion materials. Because I know, Paul, all three of us actually have used the podcast in promotion materials, and the stats of the podcast were a big part of it. It's not just, we created this thing, but also like, this is how many people have heard it. This is where it's been heard, things like that. And those make a difference. So keeping track of those things is important too. If you are, listeners out there thinking, I have unusual scholarship and I'm trying to figure out how to make it clear, that this is valuable and it was a great and important research way to spend my time, having those stats is important, I think, and useful.
Yeah, that's definitely, I agree. That's definitely something I overlooked, I think, in my run up to the tenure application, because it was just, my resources at that time were just in two places. They were on kylegullings.com that got, dozens of visitors a year, and on JMTP. But it never really occurred to me to ask the editors, hey, do you have download stats on that? That's probably something I should go back and do now, but should have certainly done at that time. Yeah. So that's been really helpful in the online textbook. I can either go to a certain spot on our website editor, or ask one of my more tech savvy collaborators, hey, what are we at for page views, or So.
Well, get ready to get the Note Doctor's bump on kylegullings.com. So I mean, like the Colbert bump, I think he used to have. You're gonna get tens and tens of views. Are there any kind of disadvantages of OERs? I mean, there is, or is it just maybe the creation of it? Is that kind of the biggest disadvantage? Because obviously the cost sounds great, the accessibility sounds great, but are there any other kind of disadvantages that you should think about before kind of implementing that, beyond just kind of maybe the work in setting it up at from the start?
Yeah, I think there's a few things to be wary of. When looking at how many different resources there are on our website, on openmusictheory.com, it can be a little bit daunting as far as what topics you want to cover in what semesters, in what order, with how much time. I don't think I've ever been to a buffet dinner in my life and walked out feeling like I am happy with my choices and I am satisfied. And I've slowly realized that the reason for that is because my approach to the buffet is I walk up to the buffet, I grab a plate, and everything that looks good, I put on my plate. And it's not just a matter of overeating, but of eating too many different things that all seemed good at the time. But, when I really should have probably just, picked the fillet and to narrow my choices and to be more aware ahead of time about making a plan about what my buffet curriculum will look like. And so I think that's, something I've learned about myself, but something that can be daunting for someone who didn't, help write openmusictheory.com is it's not meant like a lot of textbooks where you start at the beginning and by the end of semester 4 you're at the end, right? There's no possible way you can cover everything in there. There's way too much material, and so it's designed for you to kind of curate it. And even though we say so in the preface, assuming everyone who's designing their courses with this reads the preface, that's a big challenge, and it's not something you can just pick up the week before you start teaching. And now we're trying to get there. We would like at some point to say, hey, here's one possible path through the Theory 1 through 4 sequence that covers these topics in this order and spends 2 weeks on this and 3 weeks on this. That would probably be helpful, but we're not quite there yet. So that's one disadvantage, is just kind of the dizzying array of resources that exist. Even if you just only stick with ours, for example, there's just too much to fit into a standard 4-semester sequence by design. So not saying yes to everything. There's probably some other disadvantages. Just the same disadvantage you'd get from adopting any new textbook, right? If you're going to go from the Koskapane to the Marvin Clendenning, then you're going to have to learn new material and a new way to teach it. So that's always a challenge. Overcoming that inertia, especially if you've got a heavy teaching load or a heavy research load, it's daunting to just even take that step. And I may also mention we don't have a publisher. We don't have a for-profit publisher or an academic press that's telling us this is what you have to cover by this time. And so that's also, although we have had a stage of peer review editing, that we had someone go through the book for style and things like that, it's not probably quite the polished final draft that you might expect from a traditional physical textbook. As well, because it's still kind of evolving in some ways. So that's sometimes a disadvantage.
Yeah, I think they're modular. It's kind of modules, and they're even, I think, listed sort of alphabetically. Fundamentals is first, but after that, it's not like you could trace down through those things like, oh yeah, theory 1, theory 2, theory 3, theory 4. It kind of goes, in categories of things, chromaticism and popular music and form and counterpoint and things like that.
Yeah. And that's always been tricky for me is, do we cover the form section first or the harmony section first, or do we do both of them? And you have to know about tonicization, otherwise you can't talk about periods really in most practical applications. So that's in my own curriculum, I kind of jump back and forth and do a little bit of everything.
That makes sense.
But yeah, it is designed that way. It's designed to be curated. It's not necessarily already curated for you, and the chapters aren't numbered, for example. You can't just say, oh, turn to chapter 17, which is something that I kind of miss about the Koskapane, right? I remember that, am I right? Chapters 14 and 15, at least back when I was teaching on that, were the last two that incorporated seventh chords into their part writing or something like that. Right. That I could at one point quote the whole textbook. I could even say
chapter by chapter
on this page, right? There's this diagram. So I don't really. It's not a resource that's like that where you can follow it in that sequential way.
Now you may not be able to answer this because you may not have written the chapter on this, but the Koskapane is a 1/6/4 book. What is Open Music Theory's opinion on the 1/6/4 chord? This is where the conversation turns very tense right now.
I'm just gonna log out right now. No, So I always learned it as a 164, and that made the most sense to me. But my theory expert colleagues, I believe, use the cadential 6/4, the 5/6/4 --53, if that's what you're referring to.
Okay.
And I've reluctantly, with this year, is actually the first time I've adopted that notation as well. And I've got some students in my theory class who have some theory background, and it's awful hard to train them out of that and try to convince them that this is the only chord where the Roman numeral doesn't match the contents of the pitches. But it makes sense from a functional standpoint to designate this as a cadential 6/4 instead of a passing. So my answer is I use the 5/6/4 as the cadential. Again, reluctantly, it's not how I was taught, but that I think it's an improvement, and I can see the argument for it. So that's how I teach it now. But I'm also very open with my students about that particular issue, right? In as much as I know about it, I don't know. I explain what I understand of that contention, and I say not every classroom does it the same way, right? And here's the functional approach to it, and here's the how the notes are spelled approach, and here's why we're doing this one. I talk very freely. You heard me earlier talk about Bloom's taxonomy, and I explained to them, because more than half of our graduates are going to go on to be music educators at UT Tyler, and it's mostly what we turn out is band directors and some choir directors. They need to know that, right? They need to know that you don't just only teach something for memorization. You also have these other approaches, and I find, and when I first got into OER and spent all that time writing these worksheets and then throwing them at my unprepared students, I was very, very open with them, saying, like, you're the first person who's ever seen this worksheet. I designed it last Thursday. Let me know if you see any errors. But I think they really they appreciate that, right? They appreciate being brought into the pedagogical side of it, because they're, in one way or another, going to end up teaching somebody in the future. And I think that's, anyway, that was not your question at all. The 5/6/4.
Well, it's a good question, because it does hit at a little bit of people's core philosophies in a certain way. I think you offered a really good answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Well,
CAD 6/4 is an option. Let's just put that out there.
CAD 6/4, yeah.
I love CAD 6/4.
I'm still a 1/64 person because I have tried both 5/64 and CAD 6/4, and the students get it wrong over and over again. And so I finally just was like, it's a 1/64. It's the only one where we, like you said, it's the only one where the label doesn't match the stuff. And I just was like, it's not. And we have de-emphasized part writing. We still do it, but it's de-emphasized in our curriculum, as is figure bass, all of those things. So they don't even know what figure bass symbols are when we're introducing 6/4 chords. They have no idea. They know what inversion symbols are. They don't know what figure bass is. They find that out in Theory 3. So our music business majors never interact with that at all.
Which I think is appropriate.
yeah, exactly. Like they're not likely to be recording, period Baroque pieces where people are improvising on an RO or something. So,
Viola da gamba.
Right. Exactly.
How do you mic a viola da gamba? Maybe they'll have to know how to do that.
Maybe they will, but that is not what I have to teach them. So, in the end,
right.
Like you're right, Ben, it is kind of a philosophical thing, because for us, since we don't do figure bass, since we have de-emphasized part writing, the 1/64 is the one that makes the most sense in their sweet little freshman year brains. So that's the one we use. Yeah. There you have it.
I love it.
Well,
I love this little sidebar.
I'll be honest. I'm not familiar with the CAD. So just CAD period 6/4. So we just like be Switzerland about it and say it's it's neither of the above. It's just the cadential 6/4.
Yeah.
I'll elaborate a little bit since you opened the door for that. I just have mine label it based on the function. So if you're analyzing and you come across a 6/4, don't use a Roman numeral. Tell us the function of that 6/4. Is it a passing? Is it a pedal? Is it arpeggiating? Is it a cadential? And if you want to go beyond that, sure, okay, have your cake and eat it too. But I'll stick to those 4, and I'll have them label the function and just leave the Roman numeral out of the equation. But that's a hot take, so, I'm sure we'll get some commentary on that in the future. But
nice.
I will just let that sit.
Yeah, all the commentary that pours in every time.
Yeah.
Every
gonna Google it.
episode.
Yes.
Tons of commentary about what we say. I think you're good, Ben.
tons.
Nice. I
But
appreciate
you're right.
the
It is a
education
Switzerland
about it.
approach. No doubt.
For sure.
And if a student asks me, I say, is music theory chord labeling? And I hope that they say no. And I said, it's about a way of understanding. And if you put it passing 6/4, you're telling us you're expressing a way of understanding how that passage actually works. And I like that way of approaching it. I don't know if anybody else does that or not, but I just kind of morphed into that over the years.
Yeah, I've never heard of all of them being labeled according to their function. I like that better than just like one of them is called a CAD 6/4. Everyone else gets their Roman numeral or their whatever, you know. I like the idea that it acknowledges the sort of dissonance of a 6/4 chord. We are deep down a rabbit hole now.
We are. We really
No,
are.
but in
How
all
did we ever get here?
seriousness, I bet if you really emphasize that, though, that you probably get way less part writing problems that involve non-typical 6/4 chord use than I do, because I get it all the time. People don't seem to care what a 6/4 chord is; they'll just throw it in anywhere. 3/6/4, fine, right? But I bet because I don't really emphasize that as much, I do talk about it when they write it. I say this isn't how we do things, but coming at it from that approach, I bet you get fewer of those than I do.
You just have a lot of Adele fans with the 3/6/4. That's what it is. She loves the 3/6/4.
All right. So I should
it's
stop
always
telling
between
my
1 and 6.
I should stop telling my students that chord doesn't exist. Then.
Only if you're Adele.
Okay. Gotcha.
But I think Ben, you bring up a good point about like the function or just understanding how music works, and that's what theory is about. And I think composers have a particular knack at being able to explain how music works because composers write it. And so, so Kyle, how has, your composer background, you've kind of talked to like kind of an outsider, but I personally think that composers have a really unique and helpful perspective when teaching theory because it's not like theory comes after music almost all the time, right? You could say the 12 tone comes before, like that system, but all the theoretical concepts that we learn, it's from music, right? The theorists look at the music and say, how does this work? The composers aren't thinking, oh, is this a 3/6/4? Am I allowed to use a 3/6/4? No, Adele just writes it, and then theorists have to figure it out. So how has your career as a composer and your informed your theory teaching?
Yeah, I mean we're applied theorists, right?
I like that.
We actually use it, or sometimes, or we're making music theory as we go. I'm a strong believer that whether you're a composition-focused faculty or student or not, that composition has to have an important part in every semester of the theory sequence, right from the very beginning. Even when you feel like they don't necessarily know enough to create a full-fledged piece of music, you've got to get them doing something creative, and not just for creativity's sake and not just for engagement's sake, but because it actually demonstrates something qualitatively different than label this chord, label this scale. It's showing that they understand it. They understand the topic's function and how it works so well that they can go back and use it in the service of some specific project. And so I have a composition project in every semester of Theory 1 through 4. As I mentioned earlier, I talk about Bloom's taxonomy while I'm introducing the composition project and tell them, look, here we are at the peak. We're going to go back 3 or 4 weeks to stuff you learned then and use that in the service of this, because now you really know it. So I pretty much take concepts from the midterm and put that at a semester ending composition project. But I find that most of my students are kind of terrified of composition at first, if they're not some of the minority of students who are composition majors. But once, depending on how you package that project, it doesn't have to be write a minuet from beginning to end. Good luck. It can be a lot more, I don't want to say hand holding, but a lot more pared down than that, and limit their kind of stylistic choices. But so we don't do a ton of part writing as major projects, but we do at the end of Theory 2, I assign a diatonic 4-voice chorale setting that follows the phrase model. It's got tonic prolongations, dominant prolongations in it. So a couple of other like boxes to check, but it's really just one chorale phrase. And so this past year, spring 23, our class voted to use, I make them write lyrics, and that's not graded, but they have to use them. And so I told them to write on a theme of love songs. It's really short. It's like 10 or 15 syllables, right? Because they can't set an entire chorale and modulations and all that yet. So some did love songs just to a generic or unnamed person. Some wrote lyrics to their dogs or cats. I had one person who wrote a love song that was a jingle for Love's gas station, which I thought was just brilliant. It doubles. Nice. It doubles as a love song, but also as a jingle for the company. So I think she should probably record that and send it in, see if she can get some royalties on it. But students really enjoy it. You come to the class when they're gonna, and I make them perform it. I don't make them perform it in 4 voices, but I make them play at least the soprano part and the bass part one at a time and teach it to the class. And we are the choir that sings it. And they really enjoy having to do that. It incorporates the keyboard skills. It incorporates our part writing. And anyway, so I think that's something that you shouldn't be afraid of, even if you don't call yourself a composer the way that I don't call myself a music theory scholar. I'll say I'm a music theory pedagogy, sure, but I think it's something that people should really incorporate more if they're not already doing it, because students like it, and it shows that they know more than just how to check some boxes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, our time has just flown by, Kyle. We've had a great time chatting with you, and appreciate all the time that you've given to us at the end of the semester when things are kind of wrapping up. But we like to ask just some rapid-fire questions, just off-the-cuff questions to our guests to get those real hot takes. We've already had some hot takes, so I don't know if we can get any hotter. But Ben or Jen, would you like to go first?
Ben, are you ready? I'm ready if you're not, but you
can
ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. So what is the one worksheet that we should all go look at and start using today?
Oh boy. I mean, I kind of already said it, I think, but I think you should go find my Schoenberg versus Stravinsky worksheet. Just be aware that it's a hefty one, so they're going to have to do some reading and some listening before they can start it. But I like that one a lot. I did talk to my students for the first time this year about ChatGPT and how it actually gets, I typed the whole essay into it and it gets maybe an A-. It's frighteningly good at convincing me that it knows what neoclassicism is. It just can't pull out the rose for me yet. So anyway, sorry, that was a long hot take. You should go back and see that one.
Okay, so I actually received a small mini grant from my university to create OER resources, that's redundant, for my Oral Skills 4 class. All right, so I'm going to be creating assignments and dictations and things like that over the summer. So give me your best advice before I go into this over the summer.
For you writing it,
or just just going out and thinking about, okay, now I have to create these resources for this class. Is there a process that you recommend or something to think about first? Because it's kind of very open-ended right now.
It is, yeah. I mean, you can always add more later. So get kind of what's the minimum size of the thing you need and get that done. If you're going back and forth between, do I need 10 harmonic dictations in every chapter or 8 harmonic dictations in every chapter, just make 6 of them and come back. I don't know what the scope is of this project, but that's what I would say is find out what kind of minimum to launch looks like, and then you can always come back and add to it for the rest of your life if you want to. And if you choose to do so, if you really want to make this OER. So a lot of universities and administrators think that OER just means free. Right? It just means I will give it to my students, but it actually has a very specific meaning, right? That it's open, meaning it's accessible, that it's editable. So think also carefully about if you are going to use a Creative Commons license, what type of Creative Commons license would you want to put to it? Is it something that can live online if you're not using other proprietary resources or examples? If you're writing all your own examples, can it live online, and can I steal it from you later? I would love to. I don't teach Oral Skills 4, but I would love to tell my Oral Skills 4 teacher to steal it from you in a collaborative
right,
kind
of
way.
course, right, in a Creative Commons kind of way, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's great. The minimum, that is a good call, because you could end up just down this rabbit hole where, yes, I've created 45 noctations in modes, and now that's only one part of what I need to do. Good.
Right, for sure.
I'll
All
go.
right, Ben.
Who's your favorite composer?
Oh man, that's a tough question actually. Well, it's not me. I guess if I had to pick, I'd probably say Stephen Sondheim. He's the first person who I became aware of that I wanted to copy. Yeah, Sondheim for sure.
That's excellent.
Inspiration for musical theater. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, maybe let our listeners know a little bit about how they can find you if you want to be found out there on the World Wide Web, and what maybe projects you have currently cooking.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me at kylegullings.com. Don't be fooled by the short haircut. I'm a long-haired hippie now, but kylegullings.com, where you can see my compositions as well as some of the theory resources I have. Of course, visit openmusictheory.com. That'll take you to version 2, redirect you to that, which is the theory textbook in one version or another that I've been using since 2013. But that's really, if you explored it in 2014 or 2016 or 2018 and you found like you needed more information or more robustness to it, it is an entirely different resource now. So if you haven't seen it in the last 3 or 4 years, please go check out openmusictheory.com. So what did I say? kylegullings.com, openmusictheory.com. And on my non-music theory side, I'm happy to announce, because it got announced officially a couple weeks ago, that I'm currently working on an original orchestral commission for the East Texas Symphony Orchestra. They commissioned me to write. One big thing about East Texas is they love high school football. And so I'm writing basically like East Texas high school football, the musical, but without singers. It's a major work, 20 or 25 minutes,
Wow.
dedicated to and honoring the culture and the people and the sport that is high school football in our area. So set your clocks for sometime in late March 2024. So in about 10 months from now, y'all come out to Tyler and hear it.
You just made it to the end of another episode of Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and review the podcast, and you can always reach us at notedoctorspodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or show ideas. Thanks for listening.